Welcome, everybody. We've tons of people just joined, and we're still getting ourselves ready. We're still waiting for all of our panelists to show up. Ted, can you focus on entering in people as they show up?
Oh, yes.
So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Joan, and we're all here in the BizLab. And we're gonna mute everybody as they come onto the line. And if you're not muted, please mute yourself. Okay, so welcome everyone. Let's get started. What we're gonna talk about today is aligning content plans with revenue goals. Can you go back a slide? If this is the first time you've joined one of our webinars, I want to give a little bit of an intro of who we are. So we're at WBUR as part of BizLab. Can you hit mute all?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, sorry, we're just manually muting everybody. Okay, so welcome everyone. So the WBUR's BizLab, our year has been spent working with 6 stations around the country on testing new revenue models. And we try every month to have a webinar where we share information that we're learning, that we hear about. We're bringing in people who are innovators and thought leaders across public radio, on the topic of revenue streams and how to test and learn what revenue streams offer potential for public radio. So it's myself, Joan, Sarah is our experience strategist, Lindsay Goldberg is our program manager, and Ted Fuller is our business technology analytics lead. But we're just we're just the WBUR part. We've been working with 6 other stations around the country, and they've been doing a lot of fantastic work. Today, we're gonna highlight 3 of them. Can you go to the next slide? So one of the things that everyone on this call, on this webinar is I'm sure aware of, that in public media and in journalism, one of the core tenets of our mission is that we must keep our editorial process separate from financial influence, right? And journalistic integrity is based on this idea that we can't let donors or sponsors or money come in and change the way that we report. So with each of our stations, we've spent a great deal of time trying to navigate these boundaries, because once you start talking about new forms of revenue, it often relates to in some way to the content of the station. We have 3 really interesting case studies to go over today. WLRN from Miami, WDET Detroit, and VPR, Vermont Public Radio. And Sarah Bloomer, as our experience strategist who's been working closely with the stations, is gonna moderate the discussion today. So I'm gonna hand it over to her, and thanks everyone for coming. A note about questions and Q&A. As usual, we wanna have you put it into the chat, and then as we get to the discussion part, Lindsay's gonna help facilitate the asking of the questions that you all have raised in chat. So thanks a lot.
Okay, nice timing, Joan. Hi, I'm Sarah Bloomer. I pulled this together at about noon, and I know a lot more people have joined since then, but just to give you a sense of where everybody's from who's joined the webinar today. So we've got all corners of the country covered, except for maybe the Northwest. But anyway, it's very cool. Some other people, it looked like they were from even out of the country and have joined us. So it's great to have so much interest in this topic and in BizLab. As Joan said, the panelists are 3 of the 6 cohort stations that we work with. We've got Giselle Reed, who's Director of Strategic Initiatives at WLRN in Miami, and Brendan Kinney, an SVP of Marketing and Development at BPR. So they're kind of representing the financial side of this divide that we're talking about. And Maida Stang, who slacked me a minute ago and said they were having a fire alarm at WDET, so she was trying to find another place to go. But there's her colleague, so somebody is here from WDET.
I've been Maida.
Oh, okay, Maida's here. Okay, great. So Maida is a digital producer at WDET, and she represents the editorial side. But we're going to be able to talk about both sides as we go. I know that Brendan prepared for that too. So the conversation, because I want to get into the conversation, that's the meat of why we're all here. We're going to have the 3 stations present their projects in about 3 to 5 minutes. Then I've got some questions prepared to ask them as the moderator. I also asked them to prepare some questions for each other, and we will move on and talk about that. And then for the last 15 minutes, we'll open it up to your questions and a general discussion with all of you. So that's how today's conversation is going to go. So let's get started. Our first person is going to be Giselle. So she's going to talk about the project and then talk about how she involved editorial. Okay, wait, you have to unmute Giselle.
Oh, she can.
Okay, you're on, Giselle.
All right. Hi, I'm Giselle Reed, Director of Strategic Initiatives with Friends of WLRN. And I actually am working with our colleague on the editorial side, Katie Lepre, who's our engagement producer for the news team. Our project actually combines journalism, community engagement, and fundraising through the creation of an environmental content newsletter. This is the first content newsletter produced by our station focusing on the environment. We are working with a third-party organization, News Revenue Hub, to help monetize this newsletter through membership and or donations, as well as through potential specifically targeted underwriters in the near future. In our particular project, the news team, Katie in this particular instance, is the one actually creating, writing, curating all of the content for the newsletter. And myself, along with News Revenue Hub, we are actually working on the messaging series and the technology platforms behind the fundraising initiative to monetize this newsletter through a series of messaging that will appear independently on each newsletter through a series of campaigns. And then hopefully the donations and memberships will trickle in that way. Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, just what were your challenges? Like what was the relationship with editorial before and where are you now?
So we actually have a bit more of a firewall than most public media stations in the sense that we are actually two separate organizations. WLRN, the station, the license is held by the School Board of Miami-Dade County and it's one entity. Friends of WLRN, which is where I work, is actually the fundraising arm, but it is a separate 501c3 organization raising money for the station. So we're actually two separate entities. And so although most public media stations encounter, that firewall and making sure that we keep editorial integrity intact by not really crossing over any fundraising initiatives, ours is even more so of a challenge because we are two separate organizations. Traditionally, it's been quite difficult to work together. This is the first project where we've been able to break down those silos and really find a way through that and navigate it. And basically, the main way we've been able to achieve that is we, at the onset of this project, actually prior to wanting to start this project, we sat down with both teams to kind of come up with the idea and what we wanted to accomplish and then assign the roles. The news team was very, very adamant that any content that was created and curated had to be done by the news team independently, that it would stay there and that our side, the fundraising side, would have no involvement in that and no input in that. Basically, we would receive the product afterwards. And then it is, on our end, working with News Revenue Hub and our fundraising team to create the initiatives, the fundraising initiatives around this piece of content. And basically, we're looking at it as a brand new digital platform that we're able to cultivate memberships and donations around, but it stays independent of the journalism piece. And so Katie and I work together in the sense that we work together on the timeline. But I don't actually get to have any input on the content that's created, but it's worked out perfectly in the sense that Katie and I understand the relationship very well, and each of us has remained in our lane. And so we've been able to navigate it quite smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that we are now creating a second newsletter that we plan on also creating a fundraising initiative around.
Great. Thanks, Giselle. Okay, our next is Brendan. You need to unmute. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be with you today. I'm Brendan Kinney, Senior Vice President for Development and Marketing at VPR. And on our team is Michelle Owens, the Director of Marketing and Engagement, Cody Fiala, our Director of Development Services, and Howard Weiss-Tisman, who is our Southern Vermont regional reporter. And Howard is actually the member of the editorial team that we've been working closest with on this project. But just to give you a summary of what our project is all about, we have teamed up with Howard to make VPR feel more local and relevant to residents of Southern Vermont, specifically Windham County. And we've been doing this through a series of experiments to increase our audience in the region for greater engagement with our content, and also ultimately an increase in financial support. We've been doing this through a whole series of experiments that we've been carrying out over the last few months, and working closely with Howard, and also our news director and assistant news director has been key to the success of the project so far. I think the things that have contributed to our work with the content side of the house is the fact that we do have a history of an open and a good working relationship with editorial. But it was definitely a history that was fraught with a little bit of suspicion and some careful tiptoeing around issues involving the firewall. But we do have willing partners. Howard is an enthusiastic cheerleader of VPR. And as he told us, anytime that someone comes to him and wants to promote his content and get it in the hands of more people, how could he say no to that offer? So working with him has been great. And the interesting challenge for us is that people in Windham County told us they felt like we weren't covering their region, yet Howard is really the only regional reporter that we have on staff working full-time and covering stories from Southern Vermont. So what we realized was that, due to the nature of radio being ephemeral, if you miss the story, you miss the story. So we worked closely with Howard to make sure that more people actually got their eyes on his content, and we used Facebook as a platform to really boost that content to the residents of Windham County. We've also reached out specifically to them to get their news tips and story ideas. And we'll be engaging them next week in person through a News and Brews event that we're hosting in Southern Vermont. So we've been using a series of different experiments to try to build up this connection, and hopefully it will result in greater engagement and donations and memberships from Southern Vermont.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Okay, our next speaker is Maida Stang. I can't see Maida.
She is.
Can you unmute her?
Everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves, just if you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
There you are.
Hi, everyone. My name's Maida Stangy, and I'm a digital producer with WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I was working with Courtney Hurt, who is the Associate Director of Product Strategy and Business Operations, and Toby Tabazinski, the Associate Director of Business Development and Marketing, to create a product that was a little bit more sales and marketing oriented and a little bit less editorial and engagement focused. So what we wanted to do was to create a social media product to promote Detroit small businesses to WDET's loyal and engaged audience. So essentially, we wanted to leverage our very tight-knit small business community in Detroit and promote their businesses and stories to the WDET audience, who we know is very engaged in the small business community and wanting to know about what's going on in Detroit and like really stay engaged with what's happening there. So how we did that was by creating a paid social media campaign for local businesses that was very narrative based in the way that we promoted it to our external audiences, and you can see two examples of that here. So we just basically created stories that we could share with our audience, not super salesy, like we weren't promoting a product or a sale or even like their address. We truly just, it was an awareness campaign meant to bring more brand awareness to these small businesses in our area. So our connection to editorial is kind of similar to Vermont in that there's a lot of a lot of connection between our entire station, both editorial and marketing. I actually am on the editorial side, so I was initially hired to better promote our editorial content on our social platforms. So I sit in the newsroom, I work with our reporters daily to really optimize their content for social and work with them in creating high-performing social content. So this was a really interesting experience to kind of be that person who's trying to bridge the gap between editorial and marketing and kind of overcome that firewall when it comes to really determining how we can monetize our social media platforms.
Yeah, so just starting on some of the questions, Maida, what was your impression of the marketing side of the house before you started working with them? How did you perceive that relationship to be?
I think before this project, it was a little bit more separate, but we do have standing meetings where our editorial team briefs the rest of the station on, including marketing, underwriting, membership, about what we're working on in order for those teams to then have a more comprehensive understanding of how the editorial team is functioning and how they can go out and get sponsorships and support for what we're doing. So I think that relationship definitely existed before. This just made it a little bit more, back and forth as opposed to kind of that one-sided direction of information transfer from editorial to marketing.
So it sounds like before the transfer was going from editorial over to marketing, mm-hmm. and now you've kind of embedded with them just for this one project.
Yes, in terms of marketing, yeah, this is definitely where we're kind of breaching that, not breaching the firewall, but kind of tiptoeing up to like the kind of combination of editorial and marketing in one product. And we worked really closely with our editorial team and kind of were in lockstep with them in terms of like what this product needed to look like, to say, in order to make sure that we were maintaining the independence of our journalism that we really value. So we sat down with our stakeholders on the editorial side to make sure that what we were producing was reflective of a marketing campaign as opposed to something that could be confused with an editorial specific promotion.
Yeah, so just say more about that and what you had to do, because you had a very active Instagram feed, right? So account, and you were going to be using Instagram as we see here on the screen. But what did you have to do to make sure people didn't think that it was actual editorial content?
Yep. So the primary way we went about that was establishing a specific paid social campaign for all of our underwriting clients, for lack of a better term, these businesses that we worked with to promote. So what that meant was none of their content existed in our organic feeds. So if you go to the WDET Facebook page, you don't see any of this promotional content. It was just served to an audience that we selected. So that was one way. The pretty overt branding that you see here, like this sponsored by Rocco's Italian Deli, sponsored by Inside Out, that was another immediate indicator to people that hey, this is sponsored content. We're working with a small business to produce it. And then as part of that paid campaign, if you look at the Facebook post, which is that Inside Out Literary Arts post, we used a brand handshake, which essentially means that we identified that small business as a paid partner. And with that came an automatic tag with that paid partnership, little kind of subhead. So those were kind of the three key ways that we indicated to our audience that this was a paid campaign that was sponsored by a business as opposed to that editorial content.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we're going to continue with this discussions where I'm going to ask a few questions and then they're going to ask questions of each other. So Brandon, you said your relationship with editorial was already a pretty good relationship before you started working on this. What had to change, if anything, when you started working with Howard?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at VPR, our history we have definitely gotten better in terms of collaboration. And it wasn't so much that we couldn't find people who were willing to collaborate with us on the revenue side of the house, but it was more about improving the coordination. So, typically in our past, the content side of the house would put together a series or a project, and then like a week before it was due to be released would say, oh, by the way, here you go. Maybe you could raise some money around it, or maybe you could help us promote it. So today at VPR, we're much more coordinated in that we're getting together at the beginning of a project and we're talking through some of these issues at the outset so that we can make sure that we have the time and the runway to raise money if necessary and to adequately promote it to our existing audience and also potentially new audiences as well. So in working with Howard, this is the first time that we have ever worked, I would say, intensely with one reporter. We basically asked to meet with him in person. I sat with our news director, Sarah Ashworth, and Mark Davis, our assistant news director. They were totally on board with the idea. They had a good feeling that Howard would be excited about it, and he was. And so it really involved sitting with Howard, walking him through very carefully what it was we were proposing to do. And like a good reporter, he asked really tough questions about, undue influence and, what he might have to do in terms of engaging differently with the public. But we just approached it as a learning opportunity, and we were willing at any point to say, well, let's hit the brakes here, or let's pump the brakes a little bit anytime that Howard was starting to feel uncomfortable about where we were going. But the reality is that it was a very low impact risk that we were asking him to take. We were basically saying to Howard, continue doing your great reporting from Southern Vermont. We're just going to be working on the back end to make sure that that content is visible by even more people in your community. And we're going to ask you to step up and be more connected to your community.
Although you were asking him to do a little bit more work because, for example, you have the tell me a story idea where people can go in and propose a story to him.
Yes, and so he was, I would say, when we set up that, the ability, and I think it was on our screenshot, where people can go and actually submit a story idea for Southern Vermont. Those come right to him, to me, to members of our editorial team. And, there definitely was an urge on his part to feel like, do I respond to each one of these? I mean, some people were just submitting like, oh, you should cover my event in Southern Vermont. But then there were other ones that were really meaningful that he actually took the time to individually respond to those people on email. Because even though the email was coming from Howard, the place where the ideas were going was a shared Google Doc that we had. And he would actually reach out to individual people who submitted story ideas to thank them, to maybe let them know that it's a story that he did cover or that he would think about covering it in the future. In fact, just last week, one of the story ideas that did come through the experiment was a story that he actually pursued and filed last week, which was great to see that closed circle.
Yeah. Okay, over to you, Giselle. You talked already a little bit about what the relationship with editorial was like before and how it's changed, and it's you unmute her. Yeah. So is there, it sounds like you had, because you had a bigger wall between the two of you, you had a little more work to do. So it sounds like you started by just greasing the wheels right from the beginning because you anticipated that you were going to have to change the relationship.
Right.
Is there any other advice you have about how to do that?
I think we became more involved. Very similar to my cohorts on this call, we did recently start, probably at the onset of this project, attending the weekly news meetings. And I became a staple in the weekly news meetings so that I could find out what was going on from the editorial side. They were everyone, I was introduced to the team, and everyone knew that I was just there to observe and to bring back information to our membership and underwriting teams so that we could do a better job of fundraising based on what they are reporting. And basically I was just there for observation and to learn. I think that this helped break down some of that wall where—
So making yourself more visible.
Exactly. And then for everyone to understand why the need was there for us to understand what was going on from an editorial standpoint, and really making them aware of what our jobs were and how it could be, how we could facilitate that by understanding a bit more from the editorial side. And I think that brought their walls down a little and were able to share a bit more with us. But I definitely think having those meetings from the onset and being very clear about what, who would fulfill each role and the lanes that we would be in, and that to ensure that we would stay in them. I think having those conversations at the beginning of the project was very, very important. So no one questioned down the road what was what and who was doing what. I think everyone was very clear, and so it was, and because we were all, we held to that. I think it made the process go very smoothly.
Great. Okay, moving on to some of your questions for each other. Maida, do you want to start with one of your questions to one of the others?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually kind of a question to both Brendan and Giselle, since you guys were both kind of focused on creating more engagement with your audience and then building members from there. I am really interested in better kind of understanding how that conversion works and how you're tracking that, or like tracking the conversion from audience to member to finally how much revenue you're actually generating, since we created an actual kind of sales product. There's an X to Y conversion. I definitely want to kind of better understand how you quantify that funnel.
Right. So
go ahead.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So for us, it's actually quite easy, thanks to the help of News Revenue Hub and kind of the multi-technology platform that they have going on. So we started, our subscriber list actually started with our email database list that our current membership team has, which was about 60,000. From those 60,000, we tested through our newsletter experiments, how many people were actually engaged with the newsletter through open and click-through rates. And we narrowed that list down to 18,000 approximately engaged audience members. That's the list that we started actually deploying the first real email newsletter to. And then from there, we are able to track the conversions to fundraising, because we use MailChimp as our email software, and then Stripe is where they would process a payment. So each call to action on each newsletter would be processed through Stripe, and then all of that user's information and whoever made the donation actually goes into Salesforce, and then we're managing them through Salesforce, which is a separate database and our membership team currently uses, which they use Allegiance right now. So we're also testing the technology platforms as well, but we're able to see who's engaged through all of the MailChimp reports, and then we're able to see how those have converted to donations through Stripe and Salesforce.
Great. Brendan?
Yeah, so we're tracking a whole bunch of different metrics to gauge our success. So it started out with boosting stories on Facebook to residents of Windham County and using a control group to compare whether or not our boosting of stories to Windham County about Windham County was actually generating more engagement, and it was. We then reached out to collect story ideas, and I think we received over 30 submissions so far, some of them with multiple story ideas. And we've also been tracking visitors to our website. So one of the things we found out early on in our research phase was that people who live in Windham County are big users of Facebook. And so that's why we put so much of our time and attention into Facebook. But basically what we're also able to see is that over time, more people from Windham County are coming to the VPR.org website compared to a similar control county that we're using. So that's a good sign that we're actually generating more interaction and more attention for the content. We're also tracking e-newsletter signups. So we started with a list of current and former donors from that county, and we just kicked off an organic sign-up effort last week, and I think we've already picked up 100 new signups in that time. We'll be tracking attendance at our live News and Brews events that we'll be having in Brattleboro next week. And then the other thing that we're going to do at the end of our membership drive in December is, at the beginning of this process, we created a benchmark or a baseline around revenue from residents of Windham County, and also performance of donations from our last December membership drive. And we'll compare the gift activity, average gift, and number of gifts from Windham County this December compared to last December. And we'll also use a control group in that as well. So we'll be able to see, year over year and in comparison to other counties, whether or not all of the efforts that we've put into raising the visibility and the connection to VPR and its local reporter has resulted in increased revenue.
Thank you, Brendan. All right, Brendan, you had some questions too.
I did. I have a question for WLRN, mostly because this is something we've been working on as well. And the question is, how are you working with the editorial side of the house, or are you working with the editorial side of the house to generate new email signups or signups to your newsletter?
Great question. Yes, we actually discuss this almost daily. So as I mentioned, our original subscriber list came from our existing database, and that's how we were able to really test our newsletter and curate it. But we plan on doing a multi-pronged approach. Our editorial team, especially our digital team, has agreed to do call to action. And that's where they will be handling how they do that and when they do that. So essentially, Katie, who I work with on the project, will create the calls to action for people to subscribe to the electronic newsletter through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And then on the fundraising side, we would do the paid ads that would go out on those same properties. We have also worked, our underwriting team will work with radio on putting spots on the air, promoting sign up, and then we are a dual licensee station, so we also are working on television spots on the air to promote subscribers. And we are also using our Google ad grant to also promote, but this is actually happening through our webmaster. So editorial really is handling the calls to action that will appear in the organic content that they post, but everything else is kind of going through our underwriting department.
Okay. And you had one more question, right, Brendan?
Yes. So my question for Meta is, I know early on there was some, maybe a couple of hiccups in connecting with the editorial side of the house on this, the concept of your BizLab project. And I wonder if you had to do it all over again, do you think that you would approach that group differently or approach the project pitch differently?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that it would be a different approach, but I do think it would be looping the editorial team as a whole in way earlier. I think that we got a little bit ahead of ourselves and had really kind of developed this product that we thought was, great and so smart and so innovative. And then as soon as we presented it to our editorial stakeholders, there was a lot of concern about, the branding and making sure that it was clear. Which I mean was very valid, but I think had we had those conversations earlier on in the process to really establish what everybody expected in terms of both look and feel and execution, we would have been a lot more successful earlier on, instead of kind of like coming up with something and working to finesse it and perfect it and then getting to a point where it was kind of turned down and we had to go back to the drawing board and say like, okay, what does this actually need to look like and how can we actually execute this? I will say though, once we did have that initial meeting where we got some pushback and some really helpful feedback, we went to the next meeting with a lot of options that our editorial team could kind of look at, select what they liked, what they didn't like, what resonated with them, both creatively and from an editorial perspective. And I think going back to that team with feedback that really addressed their concerns was probably the best thing that we did in that process, because it showed that we were listening and that we were, willing to be team players and making sure that we established a really, cohesive product that worked both for the marketing side and for the editorial side.
Thanks, Maida. Do you have any questions, Giselle?
I actually do. I have a question for Maida. Who decides, the editorial or the fundraising side, on which businesses to feature, and has that been an issue?
That's a great question. So far, it's been the fundraising side, but deciding which businesses we feature was something that we discussed when we met with editorial as well. And I think everybody was on the same page that we wanted to work with businesses that align with our kind of brand identity already. So our content, we have 2 daily talk shows, both of which do highlight local businesses and kind of what's going on. And that's kind of where the idea for this product came. While we were kind of working on developing what that would look like, we actually, both of our programs highlighted 2 different small businesses that week. So it seemed like a really authentic and native connection already. And then I think it's just kind of, we've been working from a fundraising perspective, we've been working to identify businesses who aligned with our brand identity. And then the editorial side kind of just reinforced that we want to make sure that we're doing that, as opposed to picking like, a construction company that has nothing to do necessarily with what we're discussing on a day-to-day basis. So it's been pretty collaborative, and I would envision it being so moving forward.
Okay. If that's great. Do you have any more questions, Giselle?
I have one more question. I have one. Yes. I have
okay, good. Because, and I want to encourage the listeners that if you have questions, post them in the chat box, because we're going to open it up to questions to everybody else after this next question from Giselle.
I have a question for Brendan. Do you find that it was difficult because you are working with a journalist in a particular area, and obviously you are trying to get him more engaged with the community? Did you find it a challenge to have editorial more engaged in the community, or community engagement? Did you find it difficult to kind of convince editorial to do that, or was he excited to do so?
Yeah, so Howard lives in the community that he covers. So I think that's, that makes it automatically a little bit easier for him. I think was more challenging for him was, how much more do you want me to be engaged? And so one of the early things that I had to do with Howard, because Facebook was such a key part of our strategy, is I actually had to coach him on the phone for about an hour to spruce up his personal Facebook profile. So he didn't use Facebook very much. And so I think his last post was from like 2017. So we put a professional looking headshot. We added some new posts about VPR content. We also made it so that you could follow his profile and not necessarily have to friend Howard. And then once he was kind of, cleaned up, so to speak, from a social media perspective, it was better for him to engage that way on Facebook through that new profile as opposed to his existing profile. So that was something that he wasn't necessarily used to or necessarily ready for. He was definitely reticent about potentially being attacked or questioned on social media. So I think we actually took a little bit of a step back of having him go all in on Facebook in terms of trying to engage with people on social media. I think next week when we have the in-person event, I think, we know from other events that Howard is really good with a crowd. So I think that we're super excited about that opportunity. And I think that, because he lives in the community that he covers, he already has a fair amount of connection. I think for him, it's always a question of, as a reporter and as a representative of VPR, which hat am I wearing depending on which person I'm speaking with? And that can sometimes be tricky.
Great.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions? No. Well, I see Katie Lepre there. Do you mind speaking a little bit, Katie?
What could I talk about?
Let me introduce you. So Katie is Giselle's colleague on the editorial side, helping to produce the newsletter for them. So what has that experience been like for you, working more closely with friends from WLRN?
So it's actually been pretty innovative. I had no idea what Giselle did. And so actually, working with her side by side in this collaborative way was really insightful. There is a little bit of, that silo that she was talking about really does exist. And so having both of our feet in the door, working on this project where she could see the actual content that we were producing in real time, and then have that be written by me or curated by me, put into the newsletter, and then she would be able to kind of input her, she had feedback, and then we kind of talked about it, but it was always up to me to really make the final decision, which I appreciated. She was, very, very supportive, had set really good boundaries, and at the end of the day, it's just been me and editorial, and we've had no issues whatsoever. I also should note that this is the first newsletter that I've ever written, and the first time that our newsroom has had a reporter-driven newsletter. So it was pretty innovative for like the entire station to actually release this type of product, and our audience responded really well to it as well.
Yeah, you hear from people because you're the face of the newsletter, a bit like what VPR is doing with Howard, being the face of Southern Vermont reporting. When the newsletter comes out from WLRN, it says, "Hi, it's Katie here," right?
It does.
So that relationship is really important.
Yeah, and people have actually reached out to me in different ways to attack us, which is nothing new. They've also reached out to share their appreciation and their thanks, saying like, "I'm really glad you do this stuff. This has been really helpful. I'm going to pass this on to my friends. I'm really glad, WLRN is in the community like this." And then we even have a kind of send us your tips project at WLRN. And so I've been able to also restart that up in the newsletter, within the body of the newsletter. And so we've also gotten tips. Actually, I'm personally working on a story about iguanas, because people don't know that iguanas are invasive in South Florida. So it's actually like there is a direct correlation between the content that we're producing, putting it out there, engaging with our audience, and then that coming around and becoming those questions becoming content that we're distributing to our audience.
Great. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Hey everyone. So this is Joan. All of these are really great examples of success. And we started out talking about this webinar in terms of it's still important to maintain a separation between revenue and editorial. So a question for all of you is, where is that line now? Like, what will you not ask Howard to do at VPR? And what would you not ask Katie to do at WLRN? And
what won't you do? Right.
Yeah, like where do you, like the line has shifted or maybe it hasn't. But what are the lines that can't be crossed? So, because there still is some tension. Giselle, it sounds like you have thoughts.
Yeah, so I think we are more comfortable in being able to have more discussion. So I'd like to start with that. We're definitely more comfortable. We're willing to have more conversations and ask questions of each other. But I think just this morning, it was very clear on where the line is. We have to create the fundraising messaging for our next newsletter. And Katie is basically like, "I'm out. That's all you and your team. You guys create the messaging that goes in for fundraising," and she won't have a part of it. That will basically be inserted after her newsletter is curated. So while I may have an opinion on what I think, what format I like, or what pictures, I like more pictures or this, and I might give some input into that. It's purely opinion and input, whether she chooses to use it or not. But she definitely, absolutely does not have any input on how we craft the fundraising message. That is completely on our side, and that's a perfect example of setting that hard line of her job is content and our job is fundraising.
So Maida, your role straddles both. So how do you have that firewall inside your brain of what you allow one side to do and the other side?
I will preface it by saying it's probably an imperfect firewall. Like, sometimes I feel like I'm playing ping pong with my own head, trying to kind of figure out what that should look like. I think my rule of thumb has become, when in doubt, like, escalate it. Make sure my news director is comfortable with it. Make sure my digital editor is comfortable with it. Make sure I'm getting as many eyes and opinions on it as possible, which is something I generally don't love, because that just means there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But I want to make sure everybody is comfortable with it. And so I think that's kind of what this experience has really taught me, is I just need to kind of vet it with anybody who could, possibly be concerned with it. And oftentimes that means just stopping by somebody's desk and saying like, hey, does this look okay? Or, hey, are you cool with this image? We had an issue with, not an issue necessarily, but one of kind of the rules that we had established was that we were going to do kind of people-oriented imagery to really kind of be more audience-focused. And one of the clients that we were working with was really interested in getting a product shot. So that was something that we had to run through our editorial team to say like, hey, this kind of deviates from what we were looking at. Are you still comfortable with this? And we got the approvals there and moved forward. So I think that was kind of the biggest key learning for me, was just escalate, make sure everybody's good with it, get as many approvals as possible.
So I think you're bringing up a point that we worked on with each one of you at the workshops, which was the DAISY model of knowing who you need to keep informed and actually identifying that up front so that you know that there are people that are going to be responsible and accountable. I forget what the D stands for. Decider, right? But knowing who you have to keep in the loop and deciding that up front so that you don't leave anybody out.
Yeah.
Okay, Brent, did you have more to say about that?
Just that kind of from our perspective, that was also interesting because we had clients that we were responsible for, an audience that we were trying to please, and then, stakeholders within our own organization. So that kind of like delineation between who we were trying to satisfy and trying to figure out what product would best satisfy all of those needs was a really interesting kind of like tug of war in terms of like who was interested in what.
Yeah. Okay, Brendan, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just, I think it's important it was an important exercise for us at VPR, because I think that for some people in the newsroom and on the content side, they don't understand that the people that work in development and marketing care just as much about the firewall as they do, because we know that the trust of our audience is our currency, and we need to protect that at all costs. So it was a great opportunity for us to demonstrate to them that we care about the firewall too, and that we're willing to have conversations about things that we do and how it might sort of either weaken or potentially threaten the firewall. I think that, and we've handled that pretty well. One of the things that Howard shared with me prior to today's webinar was that it was the first time that he's really had to think about his content and how it connects to donations to the station. And so that has been awkward for him, because he just honestly, apparently, has never thought directly about the fact that the stories that he's producing could aid in bringing revenue to VPR. So for him, it's been more of an intellectual sort of challenge as opposed to an actual challenge to the firewall. And I think that's really sort of the next frontier for us, is are we willing to think about, as an organization, the kinds of stories that get the most traction on our website, that get the most traction in social media, and as a result, do more of those stories. And that's a conversation that we haven't yet had at VPR.
Well, and from the research for all three stations, we learned a lot about what people wanted to hear more about or know more about. All three stations, that was part of our research. So that's, yeah. Okay, we are down to 10 minutes to 4. No questions coming from our audience, so that's okay. Are there any more questions, or we'll move on to the next part of our webinar from our panelists? Have there been any failures? We like to talk about failure, which was where Joan was going to. What? Just give us an example of something that you thought was going to be slam dunk and didn't work out, or something like that.
Yeah, I think, like, what are the most awkward conversations and it turned out not as you had hoped? Okay. Everybody, Giselle's like, yes, me. Go, Giselle.
Okay, I actually have a very strange one, because it seems to be the firewall backwards. We're so concerned all the time with editorial integrity. Our challenge, I wouldn't call it a failure because it's not there. It hasn't failed yet, but it's definitely a challenge that we're continuing to go through. Is actually came from our membership department. We look at editorial integrity and, not having fundraising influence editorial integrity, and that's very important. Our membership departments are the stewards of our donors, right? So they basically hold that information very tightly, any donor information. And so they actually, we found the challenge in them not wanting to give us that information. So when we were trying to compile an audience to engage, right, through our newsletter, they did not want to relinquish that list because they felt that they are in charge of those emails and protecting that donor information, and they did not feel that they should share it, and that it might also interfere with other fundraising initiatives. So, you know, while we're looking at it, you know, the firewall this one way, it also works the other way. You know, our fundraising side doesn't always want to share information with our content side because they're used to the messaging that goes out being donor-related messaging, and they felt that any other messaging might conflict with that or affect that donor messaging. So that's a struggle that we are currently going through.
That's a great example. Brendan, did you have anything? No failures.
I've actually I was just pinging my teammates to be like, have we had any failures? Most of our experiments have gone really well. And again, I think it's important to reiterate that everybody was on board at the outset of this project, you know, and it was important, as somebody else said, to get that early buy-in from people on the team. And I think that the thing that really worked and helped with us is that we framed it as an educational experience, like help us learn what's possible. And I think, you know, in that spirit, everyone came to it, I think, in a really positive way. And again, we've been very sensitive to, with the slightest bit of resistance, we've been okay, let's talk that through, or maybe we'll hold off on that and move on to the thing that's slightly easier. So.
Okay, we have a question. Has membership support from readers or followers been negatively impacted by the project-specific focus of these varied initiatives, especially at VPR and WLRN? Are they giving more? We don't know that yet, right? But
from our station, we don't know that yet because we just started the messaging series. So we wouldn't know. We anticipate that it will only help increase existing membership dollars and or recruit new members. Obviously that's the goal. And you know, we are working, like I mentioned, with News Revenue Hub, that's their mission. So we anticipate that it will be favorable, but we just started that piece of it. So.
Yeah, I can chime in that, you know, we do think that this will lead to greater revenue from residents of Windham County. The other thing that we're doing in concert with our December membership drive is that we're building out, working with an outside vendor, we're building out a Facebook campaign targeting Windham County residents during sort of alongside the membership drive. And we have, I mean, I think it would be crazy to think that it won't have any effect on the revenue that we're able to receive during the drive itself. So fingers crossed, but you know, that's definitely through Facebook and Google Ads and an email social network here in Vermont called Front Porch Forum. We'll be promoting giving to residents of Windham County who hopefully are feeling more connected to VPR as a result of all this work.
Maida, have you heard from members or anything about, I mean, you've only had 4 of these stories go up on Instagram, right?
Yeah, so since ours wasn't necessarily member focused, it's a little bit different. We were definitely targeting a social audience, and we don't really have conversion numbers between like how many of our social followers are members, et cetera. But I will say from a social perspective, this initiative did get us additional followers. It does look like it impacted the number of followers that the businesses that we worked with had, at least anecdotally. There was a slight uptick in followers for them. And the overall, when we did receive like engagement and feedback, the overall sentiment was positive. So we got some, especially with one of our earlier tests that was kind of like a little bit more editorial focused, but still business related. We got a lot of positive comments, reactions, etc. But again, our social audience is kind of they already expect this type of content from us since we are doing small business coverage already. So it wasn't a total leap to go to serving them an ad that was kind of affiliated with a business that we've already discussed or a type of business that we've already discussed.
Right.
I'd also forgot to mention that we decided to time our campaigns on our newsletter so that they are not interfering with any of our pledge drives. So in order to not affect our current membership strategic plan and their goals, and to make sure that we can kind of isolate the funds coming in as a result of the newsletter, we decided that we would not be running any campaigns during any pledge drives.
Yeah, that's important. Okay, so to wrap up, Lindsay.
Hello.
Let me just thank all the, I should thank all the panelists before we move on. This has been great. You've really covered it in a lot of depth. And I learned some things I didn't know before. So thank you, Brendan, Giselle, Maida, and Katie for talking at the last minute. I'm handing over to Lindsay now, our program manager.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I just wanted to take a second to let you all know that we are having an event in just a couple of weeks. So as Joan outlined at the very beginning, we've been working with 6 public radio stations for the past year. We started in January, and we are wrapping up our year, and we are showcasing all of their work at a summit, which is taking place here at WBUR in Boston. You can go to publicradiobizlab.org/summit to get more information on what our programming will look like, the types of things that we're going to cover. There's a lot of interest in this event. We're really excited. We're actually pretty close to our capacity already, which is we're thrilled about, and we're so excited to share this work with the larger system. If you have questions about the summit or purchasing tickets, you can email bizlab@wbur.org. Or you could tweet at us, email us, something.
Yeah, or tweet about it.
Tweet about it if you're coming. Just spread the news.
Yep, yeah.
All right, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
This was our last webinar of 2019, and so thank you for all the people that kept coming back. Thanks a lot.
Bye,
Thanks, everybody.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.